Bonjour.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to ask you to take your seats, please, for this 90-minute discussion we're going to be having. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad that so many of you decided to come to join us today in this amphitheater to hear us talk about the French power, the resistance and recomposition, geostrategic recomposition. It's my pleasure to welcome the following guests. There's Djenabou Cisse, who's a specialist in defense and security issues in Africa, particularly in the Sahel and the Gulf of Guinea. She works at the Foundation for Strategic Research, the FRS, and teaches at Sciences Po Paris, where she runs a course on strategic issues in the Sahel. Next to her in red, you see Isabelle Lasserre. She's a journalist and a diplomatic correspondent for the Figaro, who's in charge of strategic affairs. Elizabeth Pather, who also knows Russia very well because she was correspondent there as well. And she was also a major war reporter. To my left, we have Yannick Chenevard, who accepted to join us today. He's from Toulon. People from Toulon know him well. He's a deputy from the VAR. He's also responsible for the budget for the Navy and for the military budgets. And Arnaud Mentré as well, who's a French ambassador for the cooperation in the Atlantic area, who's responsible for strengthening ties between the French overseas territories, their Caribbean and South American neighbors. Because we'll be talking a lot about our overseas territories today. And Arnaud Mentré knows these very well, both Pacific and in the Caribbean. So let's get back to our subject of recomposition, resistance and geostrategical recomposition. So let's talk about resistance first. I like this term of resistance, talking about strengths, because there's a certain kind of humbleness about it, because French is being shaken up both internally and internationally. The political crisis that we're in right now this fall has meant that France has entered into an area of instability. Plus, there's a lot of questions that are going on about our overseas territories. A lot of questions as well about war in Europe and about foreign policy in France. We get the feeling that the French diplomacy is having a hard time finding its place and establishing a clear cap. There's a lot of different challenges in the overseas territories. We've had a lot of problems with our relationships with the overseas territories, which we'll, of course, be talking about. Paris is trying to send away a third way as well. But the diplomatic challenges in France and this region of the world, it seems we're more of an observer than anything else in China and with the United States. And as far as recent events, if we look at the recognition of the Palestinian state by the UN, was a very strong statement, as Paris took part in it, of course. But now Paris has to think about the timing of this, the schedule, and we have to talk about the relations between Paris and Tel Aviv and the effects that this will have on it. I also don't want to forget about the French armed forces as well, which is the only armed forces in the UN, which still, since the Great Britain has left the EU, is the only one that has a lot of experience with combat, the French army, in Africa, and both in overseas territories. And France has been accused of neocolonialism. There has also been strategies that have been are in place to destabilize France by certain international actors. And also, if we look at the internal problems, that we have problems internally as well. We're 1% of the population on the globe, 7th in the world in terms of gross domestic products, which is very good, but we still have 3.36 billion euros in debt, though. So our rating has also gone down, which is adding to the political crisis in France and labor movements as well, which we also all know about. So it brings into question the credibility of France as well. And this has been a source of worry for our partners in Europe as well. So France still has conserved its rank throughout the world, but it's more and more difficult. We talk about the weakening strength of France around the world, its presence around the world. Is it just paranoia if we say that our country is being observed, being examined by both our partners and our adversaries who want to take advantage of our weaknesses? What are the questions we should be asked about France's influence in the world? Maybe you, Isabelle Lasserre, you could start first, if you want to answer that question for us. And tell us a little bit about the current situation, since our other guests today have a little bit more specific areas of competence. Sure. I would see three main reasons for this weakening of the French influence internationally. There's a geopolitical reason. One has to do with the French presidency. And the third reason is about the political and economic conditions in the country right now. So the initial one is the geopolitical questions. We are in a period now of, there's a reshuffling of going around the world with a certain number of countries that we could name, Russia, for example, China, Iran, North Korea, who have been assisted sometimes by Turkey and also assisted by other countries as well, which we call the Global South, which is kind of an incorrect term, but these countries are calling into question Western power. That is, the institutions, the structures set up after World War II and dominated by the United States and its allies, mainly European. These countries developed economically and demographically, and now they're wondering what the political price is of their development. And they want to impose a model that is not the classic model that we know here in Europe. It's a model that is not systematically based on, and this is a euphemism, based on democracy, based on rules and laws, or based on diplomacy. They use force in a different way, and they have no problems using force. And as part of this change in the political contract, France still has an important role to play. We're still an important part of this because we have a permanent seat at the Security Council of the UN. We also are a nuclear power, of course. We have armed forces. We have quite a significant armed forces. And we have a more global vision of the world, which some of our countries in the European Union don't have, except for maybe Great Britain. So it's not about France losing its importance. It's more about how France can fight can face the military conflicts abroad and all the different political aspects abroad, also in Africa as well. So, and France is not the only one having these problems. It's still one of the keys to the Western world, which in general is losing strength due to there's what you might call an axis of protests of other countries who want to take a bigger place. And these countries don't necessarily consider democracy one of their goals, or liberal democracy is not necessarily one of their priorities. The second role is the way the President of the Republic is governing the country, which has surprised and destabilized many other countries. I would just talk a little bit about Russia and Ukraine. And it's true that the position of France with respect to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine in February 2022 was very ambiguous for at least a year and a half. That means for about 18 months, Emmanuel Macron was not able to designate the enemy. We couldn't call Russia the enemy clearly and openly. We were trying between both worlds, trying to help Ukraine, but not too much. We didn't necessarily want to help them to win. And we wanted to penalize Russia, but maybe not too much, because we didn't want Russia to collapse and cause other problems. So this line, that has since been clarified, but it took a long time to get some clarification. And the Eastern European countries didn't understand France's position. They were a bit mistrustful. They said, we were telling them, no, you're being paranoid. They're not as big as a threat as you think you are. But now we're saying, well, maybe actually you were right. And we had these same hesitations in terms of Israel and Hamas. After October 7th, 2023, Emmanuel Macron first started to propose a coalition, an anti-Hamas coalition. I won't talk about how feasible it was, but it was a pretty strong statement that he made against Hamas, who had attacked the kibbutzes in the north of Israel. and had performed this atrocious terrorist acts. And now it's true that Emmanuel Macron has recognized the Palestinian state without accepting any of the conditions that they had discussed in the month of April to recognize the conditions by which it would be based. He gave everything to Algeria at first. He promised a lot of things to Algeria. And finally, with the recognition of the Sahara Occidental Western Sahara, and now the Algerian leaders don't want to talk to us anymore. So I feel like our policy, international policy, are not very well adapted to all the different crises we're seeing around the world today. In particular, the wars we're seeing in Russia, for example, or in the Middle East, where you have to designate your enemy. And the third reason, I'll stop there, is the economic and political conditions in France today. Very serious problems with our economy today, which means we haven't been able to keep the promises that we made, the political promises that we made. And in terms of political stability, which we see in the papers today, which has now been exacerbated in the recent days, and that has destabilized our partners because they don't know who they're going to be a partner with tomorrow. And in terms of which parties now want to take over the power and be who want to become the president of the republic, but they're firmly opposed to Macron's policies, especially in Russia. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Anyone would like to respond to what Isabelle Lasserre just said? Would anyone like to talk about these reasons? Yes, there are things that I would definitely agree with. The first is that the world is changing. It's not the world that's going to adapt to France. It's France that has to adapt to all these changes throughout the world and the radical changes we're seeing in the world, in which we see what we used to consider the normal situation has become war, and abnormal conditions has become peace. The reality used to be that there was war and sometimes there was peace. This period of peace that we've now lived through for at least 30 years, or after the end of the Cold War at least, for us, it led to a deflation for us in terms of the credit or the funding we put in our armies, in our armed forces. In the world we live today, where empires are starting to be restored, where international law is not being respected, we should just remind you, to apply laws, you need force, you need strength. If you don't have any force to apply laws, you can always talk about how we should enforce laws, but no one cares. That's a reality. That's the way politics works. So in reality, to try to once again be a part of this world which is quickly changing and which France has an important role to play, we have to be strong. That's why since 2017 or 2018, we have started again to renew our efforts in terms of defense, which had not been done since the 1950s or 55. But really, a real decrease in funding for our armed forces. And we had really been down to the bare bones in our armed forces. And now we're starting to increase. And when you have armed forces and I'm talking about all the different sectors of the armed forces, not just to talk about regaining their former power, but it has to almost be repaired, I would say. We need an initial law for military funding. It was called the law of repairing. And now, finally, once we've reestablished it, we're starting to increase the powers of our armed forces. But as everyone here knows, you can't build a nuclear submarine or a missile launcher in a couple weeks. You can't make an aircraft carrier in 1 week. It takes time to make military tools. Plus, you have to have a long-term vision over the 40 years to come. So this is long-term planning, and it's a long-term efforts. So the reality is that if we want to have our role in the worldwide affairs, without necessarily enforcing our own point of view, but just have our word to say, we have to be strong. In any case, as I said in the introduction, in Brussels, the situation, they are worried about what's happening in France. And we see in Brussels that they consider France does not have the means to meet its ambitions. Is this changing now? I think Europe has a tremendous strength for France, as it is for the rest of the European Union, but that we had taken it for granted and forgotten about it. If we look just what's happened over the past 3 or 4 years, for example, when we saw how if we financed French military industries, we said that was a bad thing to do. It wasn't looked down on. Now we've finally gotten over that. And now we see that the members of the European Union, remember, when we talk about the European Union, we're talking about member countries who make decisions together. And today, we've gotten rid of the brakes we were putting on the defense industry. We saw it just yesterday, the SAFE program, 150 billion euros to help a certain number of member states purchase military equipment. And they must purchase 60% European military equipment, even if purchasing American materiel, sometimes with the F-35, could be necessary for certain countries, 4 countries in the EU and in Turkey. And these countries have American nuclear weapons in their countries, which are on the F-35 fighter jets, bombers, the U.S. bombers. So these countries have to buy U.S. equipment in order to carry their arsenal, their nuclear weapons. So if tomorrow Donald Trump decides that Europe is not as important as the China Sea, at a certain point, if we take into account the condition of our military industries, and even in America, and how it is for them to renew their own weapon systems as well. We see even that the problems they've been having for shipbuilding as well. We might even see the U.S. deciding that it's in their own interest to concentrate more on Taiwan and the China Sea to ensure imports and exports as well, instead of helping with the European fortress. And there's another thing we forgot to mention, is the need to have the authorization of U.S. equipment when we use it. In order to use it, we need their approval to use it. That puts us in we're kind of our hands tied when it comes to our use of U.S. equipment. That's why I talk about the cooperation we need in France with our military industry. It's fundamental to work together in Europe. We have to work together with these industries in Europe. And these standards that they have and the problem that people have to meet requirements of the U.S. when they've bought U.S. equipment. If you say, oh, I'm having problems, if you have to contact the Americans and say, can I use this equipment? I think that's going to give people pause for reflection. They will be saying, if we buy equipment from America, we thought U.S. protection went along with that purchase. But now I think they're going to have to realize that the situation has changed. And it's not because you buy U.S. equipment that you can count on U.S. protection. And what we've counted on since the end of the Second World War, this situation in which we're asking American people, the American taxpayers, to be part of the safety of European citizens, I think we can say that that's now a thing of the past. And that's why, to answer your question about Europe, I would consider that Europe, the power in Europe, we do have a great opportunity right now, and it offers a great opportunity and is something the members of the EU are lucky to have. We'll be talking about that later when we talk about the overseas territories, but I think we should continue to talk about the current context around the world. Next, we'll talk about with France in Africa. France has had a number of setbacks in Africa. From your point of view, what are the diplomatic costs of these recent events for France's foreign policy? Yes, it's true. There were several setbacks over the past few years. We can talk about Barkhane. We can talk about there have been revolts in certain countries, and in the Sahel there has been setbacks as well. So I think there was a loss of trust in these areas since then. Because if we look at the traditional image of France as a faithful partner, a trusting partner, we can trust, who can guarantee results and safety results over the long term, I think that has been really shaken in Africa. And also in this context, there are other actors as well who are involved now who have taken advantage of France's weaknesses and have increased their own influence in the zone. There was a diplomatic cost that is also due to the fact that France, and this is in several instances, looked isolated, maybe even I would say disconnected from the local realities, not aware of the actual situation on the ground, especially when there was revolts in some of these countries and these resurrections. And that has forced France and other EU countries to rethink their commitments in Africa, what commitments and how they would put in place their strategies. In particular, we talk about France, which really was based on a militarization, you might say. Now they're reducing their military footprint in Africa, which is clear to see. They're reviewing all the different elements, all the different forces that they are ready to deploy in Africa. It's definitely been reduced. And we're also looking at, we have to update our notions of soft power. We were maybe counting too much in France. France was counting too much on hard power and now has to use more soft power with the civil different levers that they can use. They also need to diversify the number of people their contacts on the ground in Africa. We've talked with too much with the leaders in each country, which didn't help them to understand the local population. So there's an issue of diversification in terms of who are the actors they need to talk to, local collectivities, the local population, regional institutions, entities, and also the diaspora, which is another important lever of influence in Africa. And there's also the question of dialogue. Do we need to talk with everybody? Who should we talk to? In which states? Which states in the Sahel should we be talking to? In any case, it's very difficult today to imagine a context in which there will be red lines clearly defined in Africa that would prevent us from talking with certain actors in Africa who do represent certain of the certain ambitions at the local level. And they also illustrate the crises we've seen in Mali, and we've seen the French intelligence agents who are arrested in Mali. So how can you work together with people who are refusing our help, or even looking for a confrontation with France? So at the same time, we have to have a firm tone with them, but at the same time, if we are too firm with them, it might urge them to increase all the rhetoric they're using now in their own countries to paint a kind of a black picture of France. So it might encourage them to cause trouble against France as well. So France really has a dilemma in terms of the commitments and the cooperation they want to put in place, which is also favorizes and you might say explains why Western Africa has kind of we can see a disengagement where these countries in Eastern Africa or Western Africa are turning more towards English-speaking countries and are moving towards them as more economic partners and moving away from France. So they'll say, we might turn towards countries where we already had more other economic ties in the past, move away from countries which we have this colonial past, maybe thinking that they'll have better relations with these type of countries. But in my opinion, there's a risk in this approach, which would be to completely disengage from other regions, thinking that things will be better if we work with somebody else, and then we'll just reproduce the same errors that we've already had in the past. If we look at English-speaking Africa or Eastern Africa, they have their own problems, whether in terms of the presence of terrorist groups in these countries, political instability, and there's also China in Eastern Africa who's increased its presence. So we shouldn't all believe that everything will be easier if we work with these other countries, because that's definitely an illusion. And we should keep in mind that the change and there's real reform that needs to be put in place with France in terms of the commitment they want to make to these countries, which means we're going to have to redefine the role of France in these countries where there's a wide range of different actors. It's very heterogeneous, and it's really going to be based on true trust in France and confidence in France if we want to rebuild. So if we push that a little bit further, what you're saying, we haven't really talked about Russia, but if we talk about Russia, for example, and we look at these different regimes in the Sahel who are now looking for help from Russia, mostly, Do you think it's too late now? There's no hope that these countries will return toward and look towards France? No, I don't think it's not possible, but I think it's going to depend on a lot of factors. The fact that there are more and more African partners who are now working together with Russia, it was really a political calculation that they made. They showed their willingness to turn towards a partner who is going to provide them with guarantees in terms of safety, security, and legitimacy and sovereignty. So these were political choices that were made. I would say it was more pragmatism. They assumed they had to be pragmatic, make some pragmatic choices. And remember, this is in a context where we have countries who wanted to diversify the different types of partnerships that they were developing and wanted to work with partners who weren't going to try to impose, or gives them impression at least, that they are trying to impose political conditions on their help. Which explains why they have turned towards Russia. But however, the developments that we've seen recently do show that these choices might actually might have drawbacks that they aren't aware of. Political drawbacks. When you work together with Russia, that can lead to problems. For example, in Sahel, we've seen that since Russia has taken actions in the zone, there's been an increase in deaths in the civil population in the region. All the specialists specialists in the jihadist movements and experts on security situations said that the situation has never been as bad as it is today. So if you look at the context, the actual context on the ground today in this region, we see that what Russia has provided will, over the long time, lead to problems in Russia, to political problems in Russia as well. Due to the fact that there's been a loss, there have been deaths in the local population. Again, as I said, these actors are trying to be very pragmatic in the region. So I would say that they might turn towards other actors if they thought it was in their interest. But they'll always have the feeling it has to be an actor that they think is credible, someone who's going to listen to them, and someone who is capable of providing them with guarantees that they need. That's what I think. Thank you, Djenabou Cisse. We'll be coming back to talk to you about the question of the Gulf of Guinea, which is linked, of course, to what is happening today. We're talking about what's going on today in the Caribbean and the U.S., the American interventions in the Caribbean. But Arnaud Mentré, I would like to ask you first if you want to talk about what's going on in the overseas territories. This is actually a problem that's actually popped up quite recently in France. Until the 1980s, 90s, these territories were considered as bases, maritime bases for the French forces in these regions. But since then, the lines have changed since then. We're talking about 2.6 million inhabitants in the Antarctic. The second economic zone, exclusive zone for France outside of the United States. So you could just tell us about your functions, Arnaud. You're a delegated ambassador for the cooperation efforts in the Atlantic region. You're responsible for reinforcing the ties between the overseas territories and their Caribbean partners and in South America. So that's the title of your function is very evocative of the challenges that you have in this region. Let's talk about the necessity of this cooperation in the region and also more generally around the world.
Thank you very much. This is a long title. It's a long question title. Just before I talk about the overseas territory, I would like to get back to the very dark picture that you drew in your introduction, because I think it deserves to get a few nuances. Let's be aware of not focusing on too difficult situations like the one that were exposed in Africa, and to use it as a barometer of the French influence that would be contested, challenged. I think Isabelle Lasserre particularly summed up the situation. The world is changing, and in this changing world, the French influence is going to change as well. If we get back to the question of the countries of Sahel, there was a reshuffling of our military scheme that was underway, and the presence of France in Africa was already being discussed and changing in this context. The same way, our relationship with Russia is such as the moment that Russia started a war for the second time in Ukraine, we cannot evaluate the French influence along the same criteria than when the European states and Russia were developing some cooperation projects like it was in 2000 and 2010. Who I don't agree with Isabelle Lasserre with is I believe that our foreign policy has shown a very big reactivity in face of the events that it faced, and in a world that is accelerating, and we could not understand a positioning that would not evolve to try to put an end to the fires wherever they are. And it shows the resistance of our country and our capacity to impose an agenda and move the lines. To go back to what the MP Chenevard was saying, is this: it's our capacity, it's our military capacity and our diplomatic and commitment diplomacy that is the signature of French and allows us to have a voice that is heard, where we have some good success in that field. To get back, sorry for this long side note, of course the overseas territory are a main concern in the definition of for the foreign policy that we conduct in the areas that these territories are located. And we have a few numbers in mind. We have 12 departments, regions out of France, 6 in the Guyana basin, and the other one is in the ocean, Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. In terms of population, it represents nearly 3 million French people in those territories, and 1.5 million for the French residents in the territories of Americas, and the other one is for the Indian Ocean and Pacific. So it's 3 million all over of French people, for which it is absolutely key to develop the relationships with their immediate environment and proximity to give them more opportunities of development, growth, exchange with this environment. So it really is the intuition that had the Interministerial Committee of the Overseas Territory in 2023 to give a strong momentum to the development of the relationships of our overseas territories and of overseas residents with their immediate neighboring environments. This intuition is based on also on the idea that our overseas territory are relays for relationship with many other states. I see it in the Caribbean, or whether it's Guadeloupe, Saint-Martin, Saint-Barthélemy. Some very strong relationships have been developed with the states around this area, and it may help even France to progress in those regions. It was well underlined in the strategy of the Indo-Pacific that was agreed with recently. So we have an idea of this overseas communities that are very, just to support our 3 million of residents who live in overseas communities, and also to use a lever to increase our influence in those parts of the world. Thank you very much, Arnaud Mentré. I'm turning to you, Yannick Chenevard, to continue on this question of overseas territories. Yes, my introduction word may have been a bit harsh, but I'd like to continue with those hard truths, to continue on the topic of overseas communities, to have your opinion. We often compare, or opponents compare, the French overseas territories to like a very old and rusty balcony that is not really hanging properly to the facade of France. If you take this image of a building, I would call it an artistic view. France is everywhere, and the French flag is floating on the overseas communities, and the French banner is everywhere. France is a nation that is well known in the world, and it bothers a number of countries, and it bothers them, and since it bothers them, they attack us. And I believe that we're not naive, and that we also have the capacities to attack back. We should not let people believe that we let people attack us without fighting back. France is everywhere. The 11 million of square kilometers that were mentioned are before and for all responsibility, because people call us a great marine power. Yes, but also we have the obligation to make our exclusive area respected. To do that, we need a navy. We need to have a strategy to reinforce the power of our marine, of our navy, in all these overseas collectivities. And that's what is underway today. That's what's ongoing, because we renew all the capacity fleet. We replace the older B400 by patrollers of 1,300 tons, which go faster. We replace them with drones, with communication capacities that are more powerful. We replace a number of buildings to make sure that we can deliver transport and logistics. We also have will tackle the replacement of surveillance frigates, because they were initially boats that were quite well equipped, and throughout time they became disarmed, and we consider that, considering the international situation, we didn't need to have so many weapons on board. But the reality is we completely reversed the trend, and the Chief of Staff of the Navy yesterday reminded us increase of the power and the military capacity in our overseas water. So it does matter, and it is not illogical that a number of powers try to weaken us by going around France to make us weaker, like Azerbaijan. We can wonder if they work for themselves or maybe for somebody else, tries to undermine us. And we could see that weakening our departments and our overseas territories equals weakening France. We need to reinforce our capacity to have our exclusive economic zone reinforced. And you remind us, Mr. Ambassador, to make sure that our territories shine in the areas where they're located, with economic exchanges, economic development of the harbors, and that's how also we will be able to continue this shining as this overseas France, and be part of a number of regional organizations, and speak the voice of France in those regional organizations. You said it, Yannick Chenevard, the opponents of France, particularly on the question of overseas territory. You mentioned Azerbaijan, which makes us pay our policy towards Armenia. However, unfortunately, Azerbaijan is not the only country to meddle in our overseas territories. There's China, Russia again, Brazil maybe in the Caribbean, Australia, India. So it is obvious that a French overseas territory also means the weakening of the European Union, Yannick Chenevard. We mentioned the idea of that we would transfer to Europe this idea of these overseas territories, or mingle them in the European Union, or integrate them. What do you think of that? Well, first of all, that would require to modify the treaty of the European Union, and second of all, they don't. They're not part of the jurisdictions of the EU, but on the shared skills of the EU, we can find maritime transport that could play a role on the supply, including strategic supplies, one way or another, that France could need. That's why the development of ports is very important. Developments of and reinforcement of ports. That's the case in Réunion Island, and Martinique, where we have reinforcement of our port capacities. In Réunion, we have it's on the southern route, on one of the biggest maritime routes. Why? Because the Suez Canal has seen a drop in the number of boats passing through. It's only 2% of the Egyptian GDP, and a number of boats prefer the southern route. They take the Strait of Mozambique, or they take a route that goes at the south of the Reunion Island to go all around. And we see the importance of this positioning and these exclusive economic zones, and the capacity of our Navy to make the international law respected. But the respect of law only works if you have the necessary strength to do it. And if you're talking about the Strait of Mozambique, we understand why China, Russia, Madagascar have a number of claims, including territorial claims, in the case of Madagascar, to try to weaken us. Why? Because the Strait of Mozambique is the northern sea that we are ignoring because of its maritime traffic, but also because of its oil. I think there are between 10 and 12 billion of barrels of oil underwater in this area. And it's the same thing for gas. We must be at about over 5,000 billion cubic meters of gas. So it's a very important area for the future. And at the same time, it's a zone of very intense maritime traffic that goes through the Strait of the Mozambique. So to avoid the Suez Straits, and through Mayotte, Europa, Puerto Nova, etc., that are still France territories, and that at some point they can play an important role on the control, on the security and the securization of maritime supplies if we were blocked in the Suez Canal. Yannick Chenevard, you came with something in your pocket which you placed on the coffee table. So before I ask you to answer what it is, I would like to turn to the room to tell you that this roundtable is lasting for an hour and a half, and the questions, so I could see we're starting to receive some questions. There are some QR codes that are on the side of the amphitheater, and you could use it to send your question, but I think you've already started sending questions, so I thank you for that. Yannick, what is this object? We're talking about power, maritime power, and industrial power. I would like to show you this. Somebody gave it to me last week. I was in Cherbourg last week in the workshops of Naval Group, who they make our nuclear submarines, attack submarines, but also, and this is the case now, the tank for the future boilers K-22 of the aircraft carrier, the new generation aircraft carrier. And they were very kind, and they gave me these pieces of wood. And I'll show you them, and I'll tell you why. Because even if this political situation may seem difficult, and God knows that it is at the moment, France continues to move on. And the industry continues to make sure that the nation remains sovereign and equipped with the right tools to assure its safety. And I kept this in mind. And I know that in the room we have the person who was at the head of the Aéronaval group during the mission Clemenceau 25. And he knows, with all the people who were on his sides, what the power of an aircraft carrier represents and what it embodies. Can you remind us of the launch of this new generation aircraft carrier? It should be on the water in 2035 and be commissioned in 2038 actively. So that means that it requires a bit of long-term sight when you're building such an equipment for the country. It's the same for the submarines, the third-generation submarines. We start now to be able to commission them in 2035, 2035. Our nuclear submarines, second generation, that are replacing the Ruby submarines. The fourth one is now on the water, well, under the water rather, and there's two that are waiting to be released. The life cycle of submarine is about 100 years in average. You have to design it, to draw it, to build it, to equip it, to arm it, to put it at sea, disarm it, and then you have to deconstruct it. And because there's some nuclear parts in it, so the whole life cycle is 100 years. So it's not something that you can put on or an off, if depending on what you want to do. The defense of a great nation, of a permanent member of the Security Council of the UN, has to be thought over time. If we talk about nuclear, I have this question on the development of AI and all the changes that were brought to the defense. What is the deterrent, the French deterrence system? Is it a pillar of the French power? Does it remain an important part of the defense strategy, or is it more and more on the side? Maybe Isabelle Lasserre wants to take that question. No, of course, it is really one of the pillars of the French power. And this is only that justify the fact that we are still a permanent member at the Security Council of the UN. And that also explains why France has a positioning as a leader on the European stage on international matters, while its economy and politics are a bit confusing. It is because it is the only nuclear power within the European Union. And in a world where Donald Trump, we don't really know how far he's going to go on that topic, but in a world where Europe would be completely dropped by the US, in a world that is not yet the one that we live in, where the US would withdraw their nuclear weapons from the European continent, France will be in the first line with the UK. It would be number one. So, of course, I'm happy when I covered the defense situations 10 years ago. There were a lot of voices that were against and challenging the nuclear power of France, saying we don't need this anymore, there was a lot of anti-nuclear groups, lobbies that were very powerful and were trying to make us stop that. Barack Obama was dreaming of a world without nuclear weapons. Thank God that at the time France resisted and that the armies pushed back and that the political power remained resisted to all these pressures coming from countries such as Germany and saying, nuclear bomb is not at all trendy anymore. We need to set the tone. We need to drop our level of nuclear equipment. And we were at the time already in a world where everyone who present themselves as our adversaries or enemies, like North Korea, Russia, China, already then they were rearming massively their countries, and they were also rearming with nuclear warheads. They modernized their nuclear doctrine, and we're saying, we need to set an example to reach a situation where we don't have any nuclear. We were like the Teletubbies. Thank God we got out of this Teletubbies period, but while we can commend the efforts made by the Europeans, and particularly by the French, who are renewing with a tradition of power after having believed, not the military, but the politicians believed for 30 years that peace was eternal on the continent, and Europe had it was the end of the story. It was the end of the wars in the world. Only Europe believed in it. The rest of the world was still living in a different world. And all those projects are commendable, but if you compare them to the progress of China and Russia, it doesn't add up. So we were bad with drones in France. We're working on drones now. But what are the countries that have learned the most in terms of drones? Ukraine is much better than France in terms of using drones, and so is Russia. They started the war being bad with drones with the help of Iran and by manufacturing of a plant and the transformation of drones. Russia has become excellent in drones. They are planning to have 1.5 million of men serving. China has the ambition to have 2 million men serving. And they built aircraft carriers much quicker than in France, in China. So for me, we're not there yet. Thank you. And on the nuclear topic, yeah, Ukraine paid the hard price for it. Before, because I know we have questions on Ukraine and the commitment of France, I have another question for Arnaud Mentré and Djenabou Cisse, and then will be the end of our first round. We see Trump waging a war to the cartels in the Caribbean with very strong demonstration of power in the region. A show of force. We talked about an influence that is less important of France in the region of the Caribbean. What does it mean for the Gulf of Guinea when we hear the Americans saying that the Atlantic area is their backyard? Would you say a word on that? Yes, I think we should not buy that this is the backyard of the U.S. and the countries of this area don't have this idea at all, and they're open to any form of partnership. France is a country that is liked because they're very attached. We're very attached to multilateralism. And the relationship between France and the Caribbean country and the Latin American countries, and it was very obvious during the Paris Agreement treaty. So this is old relationships that we entertain and keep and maintain, and the fact that France is affirming itself as a Caribbean nation because of its overseas communities is a factor that adds to our relationships with these countries and good neighbors or relationships, I would call them. With the Americans, we need to reach an operational collaboration on the fight against trafficking, drugs trafficking. This area is very sensitive to climate change, to environmental change at large, and there's a real issue of development of the economic relations and exchanges. But the development of trafficking in the Latin America, Caribbean area is a real concern. And to the experts of anti-drugs could develop it much better than I would, but the more they're an outlet for cocaine in North America, the traffickers are turning to Europe, which is the ideal market to export cocaine, which is harder to export to the U.S. So we see a market that is growing, and this is very concerning. So we work hand in hand with the U.S. on this issue. And I'd like to put aside the question of military operations conducted by the U.S., but considering the fighting against the drug traffic, there's a long collaboration between both countries, and I think the U.S. consider France as a trusted partner to fight against narco traffickers. I think that we have, since we talk about the influence of France in general, our influence has increased in this area. Latin America / Caribbean, Martinique, and tomorrow Guyana, to associate ALSCOM, which was a very Anglophone, English-speaking association. Well, our overseas communities can see that in a world that is more and more complex, regional cooperation is essential to tackle the challenges ahead. Thank you very much, Arnaud Mentré. Djenabou Cisse, what is the possible impact in the Gulf of Guinea? In what do we look at how do we look at the Caribbeans if we're in the Gulf of Guinea? It's because it is the place of many traffics of all forms, drugs, human trafficking. Djenabou Cisse, yes. We talk a lot about influences in the continent and in the area. I would like to start by saying that the African countries are not victims of that. No microphone. And that they are also playing on the rivalries between the various powers. But for a while, no matter how it was perceived locally, there was a feeling among those powers that Western Africa was the backyard of France, and it was so France knew it better, and so we let them lead the operations in the area. And I think that explained as well a lot of free riding and clandestine people traveling to the EU, because the EU was very happy for a while not to get involved and let France deal with it. So then, with the latest events and the decrease of French influence in the area, it opened the door to other actors, but including the United States, because the United States for a very long time were not interested by Western Africa. We had to wait for the attack of Tongo Tongo in Nigeria, where we lost American soldiers, for them to reinforce the cooperation with Niger and see an interest in the area for security purposes, because they lost some citizens there. And now the United States are looking more in that direction, but because of China, and because they have this obsession, they're obsessed with the fact that China has claims on the Atlantic coast of Africa. There's some rumors that are often fed by American intelligence of Chinese bases in Namibia, in Equatorial Guinea, and this Chinese-American competition contributes to explain some of the interests of the American government in certain areas. It's also visible in the deal that Washington made in RDC and DRC, sorry, and they're very they're very interested in what's happening there and in the Gulf of Guinea. Is it going to lead to similar things such as strikes? I doubt it. Also because for now China remains very discreet, even if it has a strategy to militarize all the ports on the continent where it operates, and it wants to project its power without having a direct confrontation. So I don't know what kind of strikes there will be, and I don't think we're there yet. But what happens with France in the middle of that? We'll have to accept the fact that France will not be on the forefront in this area, that it's becoming one actor among many others. But the positive thing about it is that it implies that we're going to have to be team players, and France is going to have to develop a real European strategy, an integrated strategy, and not just a vertical model with one actor, a unique actor that is a leader and takes the decision and all the other ones that follow. And it was something that we had witnessed with Americans in Afghanistan, so would like to get out of this model from now on.
Thank you, Genesee. I don't know if you want to add something to that. We didn't talk about it. Maybe it's the time now to talk about the Indo-Pacific region, even if you did mention it earlier when we were talking about the overseas territories in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, a third way for France in this region. Yes, it's a different way, you might say. Once again, all of us together collectively have to show the will to want to do something there. Because actually we want to do something there. When you say we, who are you talking about? The French. I'm talking about the French. Do we want to continue in these countries? Do we want to continue to make the efforts we need in these countries? That's the heart of the question. It looks back at the history of our country. There's kind of, it alternates between we're up and then we're down. And at some point, we're going to have to say, we want to do this. If we talk about the Pacific region, if we talk about the Indo-Pacific region, we can see there's a certain amount of movements are underway there. If you look at certain islands like Samoa, the Marshall Islands, Fiji, if you go in certain places there, like hospitals, the infrastructures, you can see what brands they have there, their X-ray machines, and you'll see it's all Chinese, as if that was just a coincidence. Europe does it as well. Who is participating in the construction of the infrastructure, of the ports, the airports? Once again, China. So there's a movement, even if I'm repeating myself, when you're in the Pacific region, you see a certain number of European flags. There are operations from the European Union of cooperation, but the Chinese know how to do things very well, unlike Russia, which is kind of an elephant in the China shop. China does things calmly, and they don't have to count their money or their time. That's the difference between China and us, or between us and all the totalitarian regimes. They have time, or at least they think they have time. So they have a long-term policies that they set up, which is not necessarily the case with us. As I said, we have electoral cycles. China takes its time. There was 500 years ago, China had decided to burn all of its ships. And when they burned all of its ships, and they had a very powerful navy at that time, it decided to close all the borders and close out the rest of the world. It was called the Empire of the Middle Empire, and said, we're good enough on our own. It disappeared from the world. And that was when the Western world started to take over power with the great conquests of the Western world. Now China is no longer in that mindset. And we see that, but they're taking their time. They're taking their time in Africa. They're taking their time in Asia. They're taking their time, of course, in the Pacific region as well. They take their time without bothering people. But they're also doing what the Russians do. Even if the Russians do it, it's a bit more obvious when the Russians do it, and a bit more ham-handed. For example, we can talk about Wagner Group. They are in Africa as well with the Africa Corps. We can see the debacle that was in Mozambique, the utter failure it was, that they didn't do a great job there. They blew it as well in Mali. But the Chinese, they take their time. They advance step by step. They know exactly what their interests are. If you look today at the rare metals and their strategies around these rare metals, the Chinese are more or less the leaders in every sector. But that's not enough. What they want to do is lock down what's remaining to make sure that since the Chinese dominate in their own areas, in certain metals, in certain strategic metals that we all need, in the defense industry as well, we need these metals. What they do is they locate these zones where they can find these, and they help the countries in these areas with their airports, with their ports. And the idea is eat up all the capacities of these countries so that they can take their rare metals and export them. If you look at that with us in France, we don't have any factories to process these rare metals. What are we talking about when we're talking about rare metals? It's not that we don't have rare metals in France. We have mines in France. We have the BRGM, who did work once again to see what we have under the ground. We do have rare earths. The problem is we don't accept any of these factories to extract and refine these rare metals because it's highly polluting. So it's the countries that have them who are refining them, and these are countries in Africa or other countries. So let's not be naive about this. I heard mentioned early talking about we live in a fantasy world. That's true. The world is not a fantasy world. We live in a complex world where the weak get eaten up by the rich, by the powerful. In any case, the fall of the wall thought that this fantasy world you talked about over the past decades was going to happen. So a few questions I saw here and we'll take a look at some of these questions. To what extent is the political crisis in France having an impact on its influence? Sorry, I see people didn't necessarily note their names. I'm sorry if I didn't note your name, the person who asked this question. Is France going to be condemned to have a minor role now? How can France make a difference internationally? And what are the place of the OPEX in France on the national level of operational experience? Arnaud, would you like to answer the question? I mean, I'll just have to choose one, I guess, because there's a lot of questions. I'll tell you again. To what extent has the political crisis in France had an impact on its influence? Is France condemned to have a minor role at the international level? How can France make a difference at the international level? And the idea of external operations, their impact on France's influence in the world. I think we've talked about if France can be a minor player at the national level. The answer is, of course, no. We talk about average middle power countries. That doesn't mean anything. And I think French should all fight against that expression, which doesn't mean anything. And also it's kind of a defeatist. I think we have incredible strengths in France, and we see them. If you look at what happened at the UN in New York recently, it was made up of events that had been that France had drawn attention to, and not just to organize the events. The events that were set up in order to organize the foreign policy. It was France who organized these. France was heavily involved in the recognition of Palestine. And I think we are going to remain in history books as an example in how to deploy diplomatic initiatives. France is known for that. French diplomacy progressively implemented this initiative. I think it's a good example. And there are other events as well that we haven't talked about yet because we were talking about hard power. But there was a very important feminist diplomacy conference that's being organized that's going to be a huge success because a lot of different countries are going to participate. So I think France has a lot of diplomatic capabilities. And as Pierre said earlier, I think a lot of the French don't realize all that is available in France. All the things we should be proud of in the private sector, we've able to build remarkable technology, build up technology with all the capacities that we have. With all the challenges we know, we have to speed up the tempo as we've seen internationally. And we have to find a balance between launching these major programs while at the same time we adapt to and be nimble to adapt to events, special events that occur. But I think our armed forces, leaders in armed forces, have the capacity of identifying the challenges of tomorrow and integrating them quickly into our programs. So I think we have to absolutely fight against this idea that we're just a medium power without great capacities. Yeah, I just wanted to react to to what was said that the French public is not aware of all the strengths we have. I think that's a major issue. It's an educational issue because we have a problem in France with communication strategies, which some of the other states like Russia have definitely capitalized on. And if we want to talk about America as well, the United States, the comparative advantages of France have not been highlighted enough and are not known enough. And that's something, a real issue for us, even at the European level, to enhance and highlight all the different advantages of France. And I think the advantages we offer are even better and even more important than talking about just our fight against Russia, because we keep criticizing Russia, but at the same time, that is what they want us to do. That's what Russia wants us to do. But there's a more long-term plan, which would be to develop our own communication and highlight what we know how to do well, and the things that we do well and have always done very well. And I think that could be a real pillar for how we could rethink our view of French power. Yannick Chenevard, I know, looking at the recent events in the government of the budgetary questions and the resignation of the Prime Minister, what could you tell us about the military budget that may be adopted at some point, we can hope in 2025? First of all, to answer one of the questions, because it was a question about current events in French politics, very simple answer to that question. If we look at the DAH, who says that countries don't have friends but they only have their own interests, if we look at the current situation, first, our enemies are rubbing their hands right now. Our friends are rubbing their hands, and our enemies are rubbing their hands. What we mean is we have to always, without ceaselessly, continue to think about what's happening in our own country. So if we look at the budget in our country, if I look at the budget in 2024, the military program for 2024 to 2030, each yearly, at the end of each year, it is 55.5 billion euros. It has to be voted on time, though. If it is not voted, which is not the case last year, we'll have delays in the payment, in particular for our industrial partners. And our industrial partners should keep in mind that we had about 1.5 billion euros to pay to the manufacturers, which was kind of an offset in the money, and that's a lot of money. In particular, the companies that are number 2 or 3 or 4 on the operational chain. The biggest companies can somehow manage to get by, but the DGA, the French government procurement company agency, only paid them at the end of June instead of at the beginning of the year. It'd be like in your household, if you got your salary, in January, you only got paid in June. So what you have to do if you don't get paid, you have to ask for a loan. So this budget has to get voted on. I hope it'll be presented to the Assembly next week. I sincerely hope so, because that way that'll enable us to put in place the program. But we have voted for the military program, and this sets up through 2030 France's strategy, military strategy. But within this strategy, there are reminders in there, and the President of the Republic brought this up again, that in addition to this $3.2 billion margin, which is included in the yearly stipend, there's also an additional 3 billion euros, depending on changes in the international context. And we could accelerate a certain number of programs if necessary. We mentioned this earlier. We talked about drones. We can also talk about quantic programs. We're at about 300 million euros to win the war on the quantic war. If we look at the military aspects, this will multiply our powers. It will multiply our computing capacities and to break codes to a degree that you can't even imagine, compared with the traditional means. If it used to take 3 weeks to break a code, with quantic systems, it'll take not even a minute. You can be able to detect a certain number of signals in different universes that we're not even aware of doing today. So you can see from this example to what degree the budgetary aspects and the money they've added into the military program is extremely important to our sovereignty and to our liberty and freedom. Thank you. So 2 more questions I wanted to ask. One is an anonymous question. What are the place of French's external operations in the French's strategy to increase its power? And another is, what is our strategy for international cooperation? And another question, which I think is something a lot of people would like us to answer, what are the roles of the major French companies like LVMH, Airbus, Total, NPN? What is their role in the power, in the French power? Who feels like they can give us an answer to that question? Yannick? Just quickly, Total Energy. If you look at the canal in Mozambique, LVMH, you probably know about the investments they've made all around the world. The major groups of the BEDT is the second weapons exporter in the world, which means we have a military industrial base which is excellent and very solid with Excel, Naval Group, Thales, with Infrimer. We have tools that we need to get the tools we need. So the French military industrial base is very strong. It exports, and we have stocks. And it's reassuring when we export. We don't have to ask anyone for permission to do something. We can do it. And of course, sometimes we don't win some contracts. But I saw in some of the questions, someone said, aren't you afraid that Germany, if they start making efforts in terms of defense, won't their defense, industrial defense base also increase in power? That's good. We can all rise together. You shouldn't be afraid of competitors. We should say the competitors, especially when they're partners, they're going to push us to go even further, to make us even stronger, to work even better. So yeah, we have many strengths in Europe. We just have to be aware of these strengths that we have. And also, this might make you laugh, and it's just something I want to say. And if we had a little bit of political stability, that wouldn't hurt. I don't know if you want to add anything, or Isabelle, if you want to add any last point. Yes, just talk about the political crisis. I don't actually see it that way. I think, on the contrary, there's too much communication in our politics, in the communication in our foreign policy. We organize a lot of summits and conferences, but in the end, they don't really work. Who's establishing peace today? Well, we'll see what actually happens. I talk about peace between Gaza and Israel. It's not Emmanuel Macron, sorry, it's Donald Trump. But we had more conferences, the French had more conferences. And if we look at the political crisis in France, honestly, there's problems in a lot of different areas. First of all, it's a problem because of our partners and our enemies, or our adversaries, I might call them. When they're looking at France now, they're just laughing about, they're just licking their chops when they see the crisis here. But it's going to make our country even weaker, which is also already always under the intense scrutiny by Russia. As soon as they spot a weakness in France, Russia's always here to make it even worse. And that's a very serious problem, because what that means is that we're again not going to do the necessary reforms in the months to come. And our problem is always to be incapable of undertaking reform. And I don't know how we can get stronger in terms of defense if it's not just promises and a bunch of empty promises and words, if we don't make some hard choices and make some reforms and reform the social model in France. And it's also a serious problem because we don't know who will be in power in France in 6 months. And it's true that if we look at the two extreme parties we have, one is more pro-Russian, and the other, the LFI, which would also a little bit pro-Russia as well. And I'm not even making a judgment about that. I'm not talking about that politic, but it changes the politics of our country. So how can people look at us as a stable actor, whether it's by our partners or our adversaries. So I think that's a big problem. Thank you, Isabelle, for your words, which bring us back to the questions more inside France. And it's all been linked together. This has been something that's coming up since in the 2 days we've been meeting together. When we look at all the different events, whether it's reference to what's happening in France or outside of France, these are important topics. We still have 10 minutes left. If there's any more questions, we can talk about the Sahel if you'd like. It's also something that our public, I'm sure, would like to hear about. Even if we've already talked about it, Djenabou Cisse, maybe it's an opportunity to talk about it once again. And also, with the time we have left, to give us what are some of the errors that were made by France in the Sahel? Yeah, it's a subject we've already had many discussions about in the past few years. There were many different mistakes, I would say. As I talked about how it was excessive militarization of our strategy, in which we forgot, we overlooked certain other areas where we could have had influence. The military strategy and the military operations were the showcase of this operation, even though there were other things that were done as well. But de facto, that's all we saw was the militarized aspects of the operation. There was also the strategies themselves, the transformation of Serval into the Barkhane. Serval was a clear victory for us, a military victory. But Barkhane became a political failure because it was an impossible quest we were on to stabilize an area which, even in Mali, is twice as big as France. We had 5,000 men to stabilize a region twice the size of France. And also the jihadist insurrections were political insurrections in which the solution could not be just only military. It had to be, above all, a political solution. It was a problem with governance, which explains why these different groups were able to increase their influence, even up till today, all the way to the Gulf of Guinea. So this has already been discussed and examined, but I think there are other things as well that are linked, as I also said, to our real knowledge and ties with the region. Of course, there was a narrative that we said it was a region of great interest to France, but I think there was a lot of confusion between what people were actually saying, the resources we're actually deploying. And even now, when we talk about once a week, there is a weekly council meeting on the Sahel. If you go out in the street and talk to some regular French person, they don't know much at all about what happened in the Sahel, even though it was a major, an interministerial issue, a major political issue for many years. So I think there was a problem of the logic behind how we thought about the Sahel, to develop a new collective image of the way we think about this zone. I saw a question about the French-speaking Africa, for example. Could that be the fact that these French-speaking countries, could that be a lever to increase our influence? It could be. But I think we missed an opportunity as well with the fact that these countries are French-speaking. It remained the French-speaking remained associated with the elite of the populations. We didn't have the language. We couldn't talk to the people in their own language at the local populations. So I'm delighted now. There's an African initiative that has been set up at by the French Foreign Ministry, but I think it was a little bit too late. There's a lack of communication. We don't know how to talk to those people in their own language. And that's something Russia has understood. Russia understood how important this tool was. They were able to spread their message and create their own narrative in the Sahel. So I think there's also a problem due to our perception of the zone, we still tend to take a look at it from down our noses at it, where in fact, if we look at the actual context, the partners in the region, and this goes for all the partners, they all say it with respect to all the other actors. They want a winning-winning partnership. That means a lot. Of course, that's easy to say, but it's not necessarily winning-winning relationship with Russia. But this does speak of their actual willingness to cooperate as equals. And that's something that we missed out on, because we proposed cooperative projects that were very vertical oriented, and which is only between upper level from the elite to elites. So I said, you talked about what's happened at the French Foreign Ministry. We could also say something we talked about here at the FMES. It's something we've done here as well, is to compare the issues in the Sahel and how things have changed, and also compared it with Afghanistan. We also had that at one of the roundtable discussions yesterday when we talked about religions. Okay, I don't think we'll have time for any more questions. I think we've actually kind of painted a very broad picture of the whole everything that we had to go over today. So I thank you for your applause for the participants, for all their inputs. I'd like to sincerely thank each of you for your insights and to have spent some time with us today. And thank you for all of you who took your time to come here today and assisted at our roundtable. Good afternoon to everybody.